For our last video on this first installment on the Lord's Supper, we are just taking a look at the words that Luther summarized from the scriptures, which are at face value from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the Apostle Paul, simply describing that this bread and wine, which came out of the Passover, we take, and it is the very body and blood of Christ. Body and blood of Christ in, with, and under the bread and wine for us Christians to eat and to drink, of course, for the forgiveness of sins. So with that thought in mind, I want you to think about the context out of which the Lord's Supper came. I'm just going to share with you that context in full now. I know I've referred to it as far as the Passover and such. It was a holiday meal. 4th of July, we talked about Thanksgiving, Christmas, all rolled into one, that God's people had celebrated for 1,500 years before Jesus was born. So that gives you some context, right? Jesus celebrated the Passover the night that he would be betrayed into the hands of sinners within 24 hours of being put on the cross as the Lamb of God. He's celebrating this feast with the center piece being the lamb, a lamb that was slain. His blood had been shed, right? And it was painted on the door frames so that the angel of death would pass over the people that were in the house as the last plague among 10 plagues, the most devastating, would look to take the firstborn in every household. So it was a celebration of freedom from Egypt, from the slavery that was there, that they were in bondage to. Reason for Thanksgiving, a picture of a greater freedom from sin and death and the devil, which God would bring about in the future. The center of the holiday meal from the Lord's Supper, the lamb, right? But we don't have lamb in the Lord's Supper, but Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God. So when we receive the bread and wine, right, we're receiving the Lamb of God. The blood that covered the door frames that protected the people from the angel of death. I mean, Christ's blood, right, covers us, protects us from the consequences of sin, the worst of which is death. And now death passes over us because we're recipients of the Lord's Supper. So why do you think Jesus took that meal then and created the Lord's Supper from that feast or festival of what's called unleavened bread? You got bread, wine, lamb. What do you think? Can you go ahead as a family and just retell the context out of which Holy Communion comes? And talk about all the symbolism that's there and connect it again to Christ and what he's offering in the Last Supper, bread and wine, his very body and blood, what it's offering, what it produces for us, and so on. If you need to reflect a little bit on what we just shared in this video, feel free to rewind it a little and listen again to my description of that context, which covers the sense of Thanksgiving and 4th of July and Christmas. As you consider that, I wanted to pick up on a little practice that was found in this week-long celebration. The high point of that celebration was the Passover meal. It was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And again, the feast for the festival of unleavened bread was the Passover, where they would eat unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is bread that's made without yeast. Yeast are like these little organisms that you kind of like, almost like some powder or dirt, where you throw that into a batch of dough. And what it does is, like these little organisms of yeast, they eat some of the sugars in the dough, and through their byproduct, they cause the dough to expand. And the reason why bread is fluffy often is because of yeast. Well, when you don't put yeast in the dough, it's just flat. There's nothing that permeates and changes the dynamics of the dough. So yeast, because it wasn't allowed in the festival of unleavened bread, especially on the night where they would eat the Passover, because they didn't have even time enough for bread to rise because they'd be free, so they had to eat bread in haste. You couldn't leaven it. You couldn't put yeast in it. Yeast became a symbol of things that corrupt, things that permeate the human heart. Sin or false teaching could spread and corrupt. A system of teaching could corrupt a church. So yeast became a symbol of that. So I'm going to read to you the Apostle Paul's words as he would connect this thought to God's people, which would be a reminder in unleavened bread we would eat in the Lord's Supper. He says, get rid of the old yeast That would be the sinful self, sinful thinking, sinful ideas, false teaching. Get rid of it so that you may be new unleavened batch, as you really are, right? Pure, without sin. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So we recognize that in the Lord's Supper too, right? Even though we don't eat lamb, we do receive the Lamb of God who was sacrificed for us to cast out the yeast from our hearts, the sin that corrupts us. Just beautiful imagery, really connecting the Lord's Supper, his grace, to the grace that was shown as a foreshadowing of Christ and his salvation, to foreshadow what we have, all the way back at the Passover meal. All right, I talked a little bit in this video, so go back to that thought. Why do you think Jesus took that meal of the Passover and created the Lord's Supper out of it, utilizing bread, wine, he himself is the lamb, and anything else about that supper you can think about? Blessings on your discussion, and join us for our next installment when we dig a little deeper about what we're truly receiving.